Members, welcome to the meeting. It's the appointed time, and we have a quorum. We have two items on the agenda. First, overall landscape and positioning of existing public markets, and two, modus operandi of the market modernization program. I'll first invite the administration in. The Secretariat prepared a background paper on these items, CB brackets 21544/17 Let's welcome Dr. Choi Tak-yi, Undersecretary for Food and Health, and his team. We realize that many members are interested in these issues, so we will first invite the administration to walk us through the paper before we open up for questions. Dr. Choi. Please switch on the microphone for Dr. Choi. Thank you. Good morning. We shared a paper with members which laid out the history of public markets in Hong Kong and the challenges posed by their operation. The presence of public markets is part of our policy on hawkers, and we wanted to reprovision on-street hawkers to buildings to facilitate management. And the food choices available is ever increasing. And public markets have become an option for fresh provisions. Of the 138 venues managed by the FEHD, they consist of wet markets, cooked food centers, cooked food markets, etc. And due to historical context, the designs of different markets might face different issues. For example, narrow passageways, narrow spaces, etc. And these have often posed problems for both operators and the public. In terms of software, there are also a number of outstanding problems. For instance, the types of food being offered, and sometimes operators would sell dry goods, and the tendencies of also differ. The government tried to align the tenancy agreements in the past, but we were met with opposition. And in terms of rental levels, more than 1/4 of the rentals are far lower than the rates levels, and some stores have resorted to selling alternative goods. According to a 2015 consultancy study, the positioning of public markets is to provide fresh provisions to the public, so there must be appropriate cleaning and management. We would review a number of aspects, and that is whether we should embrace free market principles and whether we can accommodate welfare and non-business elements. For rentals and tenancies, is there a level playing field? While we deal with the needs of different stakeholders, how would we see the roles of operators and the public? So hopefully we can look to enhance the roles and positions of public markets. Thank you. A number of members are waiting to speak. We have 55 minutes for this item. 4 minutes each, including question and answer, before we open up for the second round. Mr. Peter Shiu. Thank you, Chairman. The Hawkers Association sent me a letter earlier, and they have certain proposals on the $2 billion provision promoted by the Chief Executive for the air conditioning charges and renovation costs. They feel that the tenants should bear the AC costs for their own stores, while the air conditioning charges of public areas should be paid for by the government.
For many years, we understand that public markets are not frequently patronized because there is no air conditioning. And during the installation of air conditioning, then they will need to stop their operations, and therefore they would and they would still have to pay rent, and so they hope that you will be able to waive their rent, and then in the first few months after the air conditioning has been installed, they hope that there would also be a concession rate on the rent. Well, previously they said that it would take 18 months for the air conditioning to be installed, and there are very worried because for the link markets, air conditioning would be installed within 6 months, and so they want the installation to be completed as soon as possible. On the auction stalls, maybe you can actually free out some space for them to operate, but then they would need to auction for those stalls, and so would there be a concessionary upset price to try to alleviate their burden during installation works? And would there also be some sort of compensation for the hawkers because they might need some sort of subsidy to help them during that time? For the affected stalls, would you also pay some sort of compensation? And because you know that if they cannot operate their stalls, then they would not make any money. So this is what the association has requested. It is really a trend to install air conditioning in public markets. And the request that I just read out to you is made by all the hawkers in Hong Kong in public markets. So I really hope that you would take this seriously. And then how are you going to distribute the stalls in the future? I think you really need to work with the association. I know that the public markets in the early years were made to improve street hygiene and alleviate street obstruction. But now is it an appropriate time for us to really reconsider? This is what I want to say. Thank you. Dr. Cher, do you have any response? Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Shiu, for your comments and for your question. We agree that we should try to optimize the environment in public markets to let them work and make them purchases in a better environment. So we do have plans to provide air conditioning in public markets for a better shopping experience. but there are many technical considerations where to install the air conditioning. Air conditioning markets also require the operators to share part of the air conditioning fee, and so when we need to close down their stalls for installation, then their rent would be waived, and when it is gradually open, then 50% of the rent would be waived. So we do believe that there would be a much positive experience after having air conditioning. Mr. Wan Siu-kin. Thank you, Chairman. I've read the paper. There have been many comparisons of markets. I see from the contents that I'm sorry, can you take order, because I'm talking and someone keeps on interrupting. I think the report is quite repetitive. I think there have been similar reviews and reports done. I do have some comments on enforcement. I'm sure, Chairman, you also understand what I'm talking about. In the past, you talk about that there have been many reports on high vacancy rate in tenancies. I agree. That there is no direct link with whether an air-conditioned market would be more vibrant than a non-air-conditioned one. Well, I think I understand this, but we need air conditioning because right now times have changed. It is really very harsh to shop or work in non-air conditioned markets. I see in the positioning that you hope that public markets will continue to provide fresh food for the public. But I'm worried about that because I see that some small operators sell essentials that is hugely related to fresh food. For example, on sewing kits and maybe nail clippers, etc. There are many such operators in public markets. And these can really satisfy customers' needs. I see that you position yourself as a fresh food market, but I don't think you should be too single-minded in this. On page 6 of the paper, it is mentioned under tenancy agreement A that tenancies are renewed every 3 years. But there are actually no such terms in writing. I want to understand the history of that. Why is there no terms written down? Because you should put it in writing that if you do not open your store, then the tenancy should be terminated. Then I have my last point here. I see point 46 or paragraph 46. I don't know why you're putting this at the end. It said, when necessary, the government would also consider the need for consolidation of public markets to release precious land resources for more gainful use to better serve the community. This is really strange. We are talking about inadequate public markets. We hope to fight against link to build more public markets to balance the market. But you're now saying that you might consolidate public markets. I don't understand why. Dr. Choi, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Wan. Well, I'd like to give some general views first in relation to air conditioning. If operators believe that there is a need, then we are willing to help install air conditioning. And so we are working towards this end. Secondly, we understand that we need a good trade mix in the market, and that this trade mix will change in accordance with times. So at this time, we are not going to ban certain things to be sold. We see some markets believing that they are not in a good geographical location and it's not vibrant. So we might consider taking back the market to release land resources. We understand that there is also planning for markets in new areas, and we are still doing that. And then for tenancy agreement, perhaps I could defer to my colleague, Mr. Wong. Thank you. Well, in paragraph 21, under enforcement, you can see that there may be breaches of tenancy agreement. And then on malpractices, we would send out warning letters, and if it continues after 3 warning letters, then we could begin proceedings in a termination of tenancy. So in paragraph 21, you can see some figures on what has been done in the past few years. Well, as Dr. Choi said, there are some restrictions in the market. For example, people obstruct the hallway or corridors because the stalls are too small. Mr. Wen said that yes, there have been many reports on this. This is not anything new, but this time we have the resources to do something, and we do have the FEHD and the Arch SD working on it. We're going to better design the interior of the markets. Should we expand the size of the stores? Should we ensure that there will be barrier-free access to allow strollers and wheelchairs to go past? This is the way forward, and so the mode of operation will be different. I'm sorry, you have spent already 7 minutes. Maybe you can wait for the next round. Dr. Ann Chan. Thank you, Chairman. I fully support an in-depth research on public markets. Just now, Mr. Wong said that this is not only a problem on air conditioning. We need to look at the entire design. That is the right way forward. We see that there is some inappropriate design in the past. We also need to focus on the hygiene issues. I see in Hong Kong that there is a strong odor from the harbor. Part of it comes from the sewage systems. It's subdivided flats, and part of it actually comes from all the garbage that has been that flowed into the drinking water pipes. We also need to ensure good management. There are many rats in markets, sometimes due to the food lying around. Of course, it is better to cover it, but then for some of the rotten foods, they might be thrown out, and so it would attract rats. I hope we can focus more on hygiene. We really need to discuss on how we can improve the environment in the market. We cannot just solely focus on air conditioning right now. There is a we are talking about huge markets. I suggest that fresh meat should be put to one side of the market. For fresh fish, fresh meat, I think it should be located to one part of the market because it is really that part will need air conditioning because it might turn bad in the summer months. But then for vegetables and fruits, they might only need ventilation. They do not really need air conditioning because they don't need such strong air conditioning. And then for dried foods, air conditioning is not necessarily needed. We are looking into being more environmentally friendly. We don't need air conditioning in the entire market.
And we want to have markets with reasonable cooling and ventilation. Of course, on the hottest days, that might not be enough. But I think we should be going with chillers. I visited some markets in Germany. There would be chilling from the ground, so you would feel cool inside those markets. So I support redesigning these public markets. I think the subcommittee can consider making some visits to our neighboring countries so that we can see what their markets look like. This is an important livelihood issue. It's about how we spend the $2 billion. And if that's not enough, we can ask for further funding in the future. But I hope we can come up with even better policies for our public markets. Dr. Choi, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Ann Chang for offering some very specific suggestions, especially on air conditioning. I think the idea is to provide a comfortable temperature and humidity for everyone. And I'm sure we would consider your suggestions. For a big building, if air conditioning is to be installed, there are many things to consider. So we might come up with alternative solutions in order to make that a reality. We would remain open. Chairman, would the Secretariat arrange a visit to markets in other countries? Dr. Chang raised this suggestion last time, and we hope to visit some public markets in July. I want to visit some newer markets outside of Hong Kong. All right, thank you. Dr. Lena Wong. Is the government determined to at least enhance the FHD managed markets? You said you have 99 of them. And of these 99 public markets managed by the FHD, can you offer a lump sum to enhance all these public markets, including installing air conditioning? With the weather so hot, shoppers and operators are really suffering inside. And if you compare FEHD and non-FEHD markets, you can see that all other markets are air conditioned. But for FEHD markets, why do you have a 80% threshold before you can go ahead? So you have 99 markets, including the Taiwan market. How many of them are already air conditioned? The government should be more committed, and you should come up with a policy. If you allow this to drag on, I think it depends on the nature of the operators. For people selling tofu or beans sprouts, perhaps they wouldn't need air conditioning. Are you going to review the 80% threshold? Thank you. The government is certainly committed to enhancing the operating environment of FEHD managed public markets. Apart from the $2 billion fund earmarked in the budget and the regular maintenance work, for example, replacing malfunctioning escalators, etc. For public markets, we do not just intend to install air conditioning. We would also improve the passageways and toilets, etc. So for those things, would the 80% threshold still apply? We would require consent from a specific proportion of tenants, because most markets built in the last 10 years or so are air conditioned. But for older markets, if air conditioning is to be installed, we need space to accommodate those hardware or components, and we might need to change the market layout. That's why we need consent from the operators. The Food and Health Bureau can work with the Transport and Housing Bureau. This is about the design of the market stalls. Space is needed to accommodate the generators and equipment. It's all about commitment. It can certainly be done if you want to. So 11 markets have already met the threshold. So if the 80% threshold cannot be met, what can be done? We will continue to convey these messages, so you will not review the threshold of 80%. It's important to obtain majority consent. For a market with 2 or 3 floors, if some tenants do not agree, you only need to install air conditioning on some floors, but not others. For cooked food markets, the need for air conditioning is higher because food is often exposed. So we have already started separate discussions. Mr. Kwai Kang. Thank you. In terms of the overall landscape and positioning of public markets, I think the FHB and FHD are saying that some public markets are hard to manage due to historical reasons, and you want to ensure a level playing field, etc. But you never mentioned that one of the functions of public markets is to counter the markets of the link and the supermarket chains. I'm sure everyone would support the renovation of old markets. We are talking about markets built 15 or 20 years ago. As times change, our markets should be renovated and enhanced. But we need to avoid certain problems. And we must ensure that the markets would not all be the same in different districts. We need to look at the district demographics, demand of goods, etc. This is something you must study. As for the small store sizes, you must have a holistic plan. And this is because some stores would be relocated, etc. So you should communicate with the operators. As for the $2 billion fund, market modernization is more than just installing air conditioning. But without air conditioning, you cannot call the markets modern. At the establishment subcommittee, you said you are going to create a new post to manage public markets. You now have a plan, so all you need is efficiency. Over the course of modernization, how can you get things done quickly and effectively? Or else you would not be able to spend the money properly, and the money should be spent soon. The public wants to buy fresh goods at public markets and at affordable prices. So if the modernization drags on and operators have to stop selling for a long time, this is not something the public wants to see. You sign tenancies with the operators and you can terminate the tenancies anytime, but the operators don't want to see a suspension of the business for a long time. If you have to suspend their business for 1 or 2 years, how can those operators survive? They still have to fend for their families. So hopefully the government can think about this and ensure a smooth modernization process. Under Secretary, I'd like to talk about efficiency. We have a dedicated team to take care of the modernization of public markets, and efficiency is indeed important. So at Taiwan market, we would try to shorten the closure period as much as we can. Mr. Leung Chi-chang. On the positioning and mode of operation of public markets, you can compare a commercial approach and the government-managed approach. I visited some markets recently, public and private. When I visit a new market, I do not smell any odor, but in an old market, I would smell salty fish and pickles. That is why young people do not want to visit public markets nowadays. So when considering the positioning of public markets, the government should think about the overall layout and hygiene conditions. If you focus on these, your markets would be popular. The current selling point is that the rentals are low, and that is why markets are visited by old people and there isn't any young people. But for newer markets, we made some visits recently and we saw some young people gather there. I wonder if you have visited those markets. But one drawback with newer markets is that prices of goods are very high and choices are limited. There are a few issues with public markets, and it's not just about store size. The design means that the impression is very poor, and this is something you must think about.
Would you really enforce obstruction? Because the small operators, and you always try to move their products out because the stores are really small. And then for air conditioning, in Yuen Long there are two markets. One market you're going to provide air conditioning, one not. And then you would see that the non-air conditioned one would just become more wetter and wetter because you would need to put ice to cool the meat, and then water, ice water for the fish, and to spray water for the vegetables. You cannot just focus on what has been done before. Well, the markets belong to you, so it should be your decision to install air conditioning. I don't think you should listen to the operators. Because, well, if you want to close certain stores, and of course they wouldn't want you to do that. But if there are objections, you're never going to be able to install air conditioning. So I think that, for some certain things, you should take matters into your own hands. You really should make your own decisions in improving the environment of the markets. Because people just think that you are not capable, you're not able to do anything. Dr. Choi. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Leung, for your question. First of all, I would like to thank you for reminding us to use the user principle to try to think of how to implement this experience into our considerations into improving the environment. We have already supplemented on air conditioning that it takes a lot of technical considerations to install air conditioning for these old buildings. So it really needs communication on both sides before we are able to do that. Well, it's really difficult if you need to get 80% support because you need to take down 20%, and then that means that you won't be able to go ahead. You're just showing how incapable you all are. Nothing can be done. Dr. Choi will go back and look at it. Well, because this item is actually similar to the next agenda item. And this item should end at around 11:45. But I see that many of our members want to continue asking questions. So I would like to extend a little bit time for this item discussion. Mr. Wan, I still have 3 members who would like to speak, so perhaps you could ask your question when we discuss the second agenda item. I'll draw a line here. Ms. Yong Hoi-Yan. Thank you, Chairman. I support installing air conditioning and reviewing public markets. We see that there are many issues for discussion, such as the rent, the corridor size air conditioning. We see that many of it is left down by history. But what is the ultimate goal for or purpose of a public market. This is to allow members of the public to make their purchases there and perhaps to balance the very expensive link market prices. So you should first set a clear goal. What is the goal of your review? You're not only reviewing on rent. Rent differs in the markets and in the other areas from tens of dollars to tens of thousands of dollars. You cannot review markets across the board because each market is different. Each market is unique. So I think there should be an independent consultation for each market at the district council level. You can't really just make all the markets the same and review them all together. I think you really need to try to optimize the environment and to install air conditioning. Well, these two are actually items that you should do even without the review. I see rats scuttling around the markets, especially during nighttime. So you really should enhance hygiene. This is not something that needs to be reviewed. Is there a reason why you're not able to enhance hygiene? What is the purpose of the review? What sorts of improvements do you want to make? Yes, we want to make it more modern, but are you just trying to make changes to the interior design? Dr. Cho, management issue. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Young, for your question and comments. I believe that we need to enhance an enforcement, and you have to understand that we have certain limitations in terms of hardware. The lack of air conditioning actually affects the entire environment. So some changes would only be made after the hardware has been improved. We have said in past reports that we would provide public markets as a choice, an option for members of the public to buy fresh food and produce. But there is no guarantee that the price would be cheap because we did not set a price with the operators. And we have done a survey and found that not everything, that for some products prices and markets are in fact higher than other markets or retail outlets. So this is only an option for the public to buy their fresh food and produce. Many members have complained that the installation of air conditioning takes too long. A link only uses 3 months for renovation. I don't understand why it takes 18 months for you to complete it. You really need to have a new mindset. Maybe you should add in some more funding. You really should try to reduce inconvenience to members of the public to the least. You should put in more resources on renovation. Thank you. I'm sure Dr. Choi has heard your views. So Ms. Young asked about rental mechanism. We are going to discuss this as an individual item later on. Mr. Xiu Karchen, please. Thank you. Well, when you asked to open up a post, then you seem to think that you are doing great wonders. But then you actually not do this reality. In paragraph 6, you said that, in paragraph 46, it said, where necessary, the government would also consider the need for consolidation of public markets to release precious land resources for more gainful use to better serve the community. I want to understand what you mean by consolidation of public markets, because there are not enough markets in many areas. I think if you remember, I also participated in discussions that some recommend that the 全景圍 public market should be built as a 3-story building, that one level be used for public market and one for community uses. But then the FEHD refuses to support it and not willing to put up gates. So the government said that they would do it, but then they were unwilling to do it. So can the administration tell us what you mean by consolidation of public markets? What kind of technical support would there be? Would you relocate the tenants and then to provide the hardware for them free of charge afterwards? Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Xu, for your question. Well, on the direction of consolidation of public markets, I can only say that this is the main direction and principle. For markets that remain non-vibrant, we believe that it might be better to actually consolidate it to release land resources. For 全景圍 market, perhaps I could defer to my colleague. Thank you, Chairman. I don't really have much information on hand right now, but at that time, because of the hawkers, and we decided to try to move the hawkers indoors so that they could operate in a better environment. But this was our views in the 90s. But then with the changes in time, you can see that some markets continue to be vibrant, some not. Our chairman, can you ask him to specifically address the issue of 全景圍 market on the ground level being wet market and the top 2 levels being for community halls, and then you refuse to put in the gates that have been moved originally? So we discussed with stakeholders on how to best use the land. I do not have information on Chun King Circuit Market right now. I can provide you with the information later on, but we aim to serve public interest. That is our goal. But the residents in Chun Wai at that time also thought that there would be 2 stories used for community halls and then one story for wet market. So why did you have to turn down such this very specific proposal made by the residents of All Way Gardens? All right, thank you. Perhaps they can give you a written response later on. Mr. Jeremy Tam, thank you. I want to ask who would be responsible for the air conditioning bill, or would that actually be paid by the government? Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Tam. Up till now, the under the FEHD run markets, tenants will pay part of the air conditioning bill. Well, I think I have raised this point many times for a year and a half. Well, you're not able to reach an 80% occupancy rate because of the unfairness in proportion of the bill. And then you're not actually compensating for those whose stalls have to be taken down for installation of air conditioning. And you are not willing to waive their rent during the closure of the stalls. Well, if you do not try to handle these three issues. And even if you take out more than 2 billion, I don't think it would work. So please go back and reconsider what I have just mentioned. I see that many market operators just rent a stall and then to use that as a warehouse. Some even rent a stall as accommodation. Oh yes, yeah, you can rent it out, but then you haven't paid attention to whether it is being used for a stall. Some people rent it as a warehouse, not for the fresh food produce. They actually use it to put their furniture or household items. Mr. Wong, please. Thank you. We need to focus on enforcement. If a store is rented for a certain function, then we would see whether they are selling meat, fish, vegetables, or non-food items. And so we would send out warning letters if they are breaching the tenancy agreement.
We also explain our enforcement efforts in the paper. And if certain things are done, the tenancies might be terminated. On a higher policy level, the problem is more serious in some public markets. So this is something we must look at in our review. We need to review the functions of public markets and how stores can be consolidated so that the stores can become bigger. Chairman, I hope they can advise the subcommittee in writing on the number of contraventions in public markets in the past 5 years in which warnings were issued or that tenancies were terminated. Please provide the information in writing. I think what you said is contradicting. You said you would carry out daily enforcement and you would see whether the tenants are carrying out the intended tasks. You said the problem is more serious in some markets, so that means you have not been doing your job. Thank you. We have to enter the next item, Modus operandi of the Market Modernization Program. I would first invite the Architectural Services Department representatives in. Members have already touched upon this issue today, so I would again invite the Undersecretary and his team to how the $2 billion earmarked can be spent under the MMP. A number of members are waiting to speak. I'd like to welcome representatives from the ArcSD. And Dr. Chu, can you walk us through the paper? And this is a 10-year and $2 billion program aiming at improving the operating environment of public markets. And there are three main categories. One, the installation or retrofitting air conditioning systems and other improvements. And the cost would be about $100 million for each market because we're talking about large-scale AC systems. According to past consultancy studies, there are many areas that can be modernized, so we have identified pilot sites for major retrofitting, and we would overhaul the market layouts, etc. And there would also be minor upgrading works. We would discuss with the tenants and district council, we would carry out the minor works, and these would cost about $20 million each. The RCSD is also investing additional resources in a professional team to follow up on these works. A number of members are waiting to speak, 4 minutes each, including question and answer. And after that, we can have a second round. Mrs. Xiu Kajun. Paragraph 7 of the paper mentioned the Taiwan market and the installation of air conditioning. It would cost $100 million. Can the government explain why the air conditioning is so expensive? The cost is disproportionate. After the decision to install aircon was made in 2014, why has it dragged on for 6 years? Can you come up with a more definite timeline? Do we have to wait another 6 years? If the MMP requires 10 years, it would be much too slow. Paragraph says the MMP would consider different factors, including geographical location, distribution, condition of facilities, etc. But at the Saiwan Ho municipal market, it is very old, and many residents have complained. For the Saiwan Ho market, would it be included on the list? Earlier, you decided to close down the Shaoqiwan market and said it would be converted into other uses. But no community consultation has been done. There is no timeline, no details. So what criteria would you adopt in considering whether or not to modernize Shaoqiwan market? 3 questions. From formulation to implementation, we have spent some time on this. For Taiwan market and other markets, we have now accumulated some experience on how we can streamline the process. But in some cases, we face bottlenecks. If we are to reduce the number of stalls, the process might be longer. In terms of the works costs, I would invite the RCSC to provide more details. As for the situation of the 2 specific markets, I would invite Ms. Wong to give more. According to a 2014 study, the 80% threshold was met. After that, we discussed with tenants, and we also had to discuss with the owners' corporation of the residences involved. And we have the Market Management Consultative Committee, and with their consent, we would consult the district council, and we would submit the funding proposal to LegCo. The $100 million construction cost is borne by the government. As for how we came up with this sum, we would invite RCSD to explain more. For some markets, including the Taiwan Ho market, it is yet to reach the 80% threshold. And if the MCC would like to follow up on the study, we are happy to help. The Taiwan market is rather complicated because there is inadequate power supply, so additional E&M plants are required. at money of the day prices, the per square meter construction cost would be $200, which is comparable to similar works. We understand there's a need to manage the project costs. Apart from additional elderly facilities, the rest of the design would be no frills. Mr. Lai Shichang, when we talk about market modernization, we also need to modernize the market culture. I visited an outsourced market recently, which is not managed by the government. The Kongyun market, perhaps it's managed by the Ling Reed. And it used to be unpopular, but after renovation, everyone is going there again. The market feels like a supermarket, and there are plenty of choices. The place is bright, and it doesn't feel like the typical market. And for government markets, if there are blockages or breakdowns in air conditioning, the government would spend up to a month to fix them. But with the newer markets, problems can be fixed overnight. So that's why public markets are often criticized. Would the government consider introducing a private mode of management, and you can give the markets a facelift in 3 months? I don't know how long the Taiwan market would take, perhaps 1.5 years. So for the other markets, they would take even longer. For the Tongyik market in Yunnan, if it's to be retrofitted, it takes 1.5 years. So how would the operators agree? And if I have to stop operating for 1.5 years, I would lose a lot of money. And the Secretary, the FEHD would obtain more information on how the existing mode of management can be enhanced. We are happy to take reference from other examples. As for the time required for works, I think no direct comparison can be drawn between our modes of management because the environmental constraints are very different. If we have a topside development at the market, this must be considered, and we cannot touch the steel enforcements, etc. But I agree that we must proceed with the aircon installation at other markets. The Tinyan market was recently outsourced by the government, and after the renovation, it became more popular and cleaner. So would the government consider outsourcing some of the markets? at newer markets, we might have more space. As for markets being managed by someone other than the FHD, this is something we would carefully consider.
Mr. Once again, thank you, Chairman. I remember last time I moved a motion requesting the government to build adequate markets and then to try to rebuild it in the same location. I think you might remember. It seems that the administration is addressing my concern, but not exactly so. So the administration is only talking about large, medium-sized, and small works. So there are going to be upcoming plans to renovate the old market. So you're going to work on upgrading works for fire services, installations, electricity supply, ventilation, lighting, or somewhat. And if you need to spend $2 billion on that, then why don't you just rebuild it? Because then you can release land resources, and at the same time you'll be able to make it into a multi-story building so that more uses could be enjoyed. Because I think 10 years ago it's only ranged from around 105 million, and now you're talking about a renovation of 2 billion. In paragraph 4, it said that where circumstances warrant, we would not rule out the possibility of its in situ redevelopment. It seems that you're answering our question, yet not so. We want to ask, where would such possibility be? Let me give you an example. In North Kwai Chung market and Setyam market, that market is really old and dilapidated. So even if you renovate it, I don't think it would be worth it. Buses cannot even turn in that corner. If you redevelop the whole bus station with the market, you have a multi-purpose use building on top, the market on the ground level, and the bus station in the basement, I think that it would be perfect. No, you're spending $2 billion for a total facelift. Is it really worth it? Page 3 of the paper on minor upgrading works. Right now you're working in Lockcock Road and Songfong Market, and there are still other Aotiwan Market, Chinwan Market, Yaomate Market, and Wingfong Street Market, and not yet in the timeline. Do you have a timetable for that? All right, arrangements, timeline. And perhaps Mr. Chen can respond to the timeline. Last time, some motions were passed, and so we have already submitted supplementary information on how to use one plot for multi-purpose, single-site, multiple-use principle. Perhaps Mr. Wong can speak more on that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wan, for your recommendation. 2 billion has been earmarked for uplifting works, so we have already tried to see where we should start. As the paper said, we have many different considerations. If you ask me which items are more mature, I can say that to install air conditioning in 11 markets. For example, Aberdeen market, the operators have agreed, and they agreed not only to install air conditioning because that cannot really modernize the market without the widening of the paths. So we are proactively discussing with them whether we want to give them a total facelift. We want the operators to benefit together with the members of the public. I'm sorry, maybe you have misunderstood me. I'm asking you the question of a facelift not being totally worthwhile. Maybe it's not cost effective to do that and you should just rebuild it. Well, to see whether it is worthwhile to build multi-purpose halls on top of markets, it's not up to us to decide. It involves other departments. Therefore, it would take a longer planning time because we need to redesign and to consider the users, and we also have to consider cost effectiveness. And yes, we do have major works and also minor works. The two other markets that you have listed, we are going to discuss with the operators whether they agree to providing barrier-free access and to widen the paths. So do you have a timetable for Yau Ma Tei Market and Wing Fong Street Market? Please supplement the information later on. Mr. Kwok Hui Keum. Thank you, Chairman. Well, we are all very concerned with how to use the 2 billion. Are you just going to install air conditioning for old markets, or are you going to also improve or give a facelift to markets outside of those 11 markets? If this 2 billion also includes facelift or refurbishment of other markets, then who or which markets get priority? Who decides on the priority? Thank you. Ms. Wong, the $2 billion does not include building new markets. But it is not only the lump sum for installing air conditioning. We are going to include some of the minor refurbishment works there. If experience shows that there is a need to add funding, we would consider applying for that. Or how did we pick the markets for facelift? We would consider the hardware, the location, the operations. We need to look at the potential. Let's say it's close to MTR station. It would become more vibrant after a facelift. And so this would be our consideration. And we also need to look at the cooperation of operators. If they're able to reach a consensus early on, then it would also bring more business. Oh yes, of course we support you respecting the consensus reached by operators, but we hope that you'll be able to announce it at an earlier stage, because we're afraid that you will just be focused on discussion. We've given you an answer in relation to Aberdeen market long time ago, but then you still do not provide us with a solution after a few years. And when you finally come up with a plan, we don't know whether you're going to implement it as soon as possible. We want the operators to have enough time to sell off their products. of course, it wouldn't matter much for those selling fresh food, but for those selling meat or selling dry goods, then you need to give them advance notice. Basically, you're going to award priority to those that would be provided with air conditioning and refurbishment. But then for those that you're only looking into modernization, then maybe that would be given later priority. So please be transparent on how you make the decision and to let the operators know as soon as possible. The government is looking into exploring new land supply. I hope that you would not allow monopolization by property developers. Thank you. Well, I also would like to ask questions. I have heard members being very concerned with the efficiency and effectiveness. From concept till consensus till consulting us, it really is not too ideal because it takes a lot of time and it's a long protracted time. So we want to ask the administration how you're going to enhance efficiency so that we would find it acceptable. And should you also come up with an assessment? We don't know which markets would be given a total facelift. We don't know how you look at the indicators. So can you also consider making an assessment on that? Thank you for your question. In terms of efficiency, we will understand that yes, there is still room for improvement. From exploring feasibility till reaching consensus with the operators, we have been meeting with FVHD and RKSD. I understand that you would like more face-to-face discussions and not only rely on emails. I think that if we could improve it, then it could reduce the time needed. Do you have any supplement? Oh, yeah. Oh yes, there are. We do have homework. We need to look at the technical feasibility, but during this time we will also meet with the district councils and then meet with the operators and meet to apply funding from LegCo. I agree with members that if we could make the procedures transparent at an early stage, then it could expedite the process. And Mr. Wong, would you like to supplement? Yes, I agree with your views, Chairman. We would look at the strengths and weaknesses of each market and then ensure that we'll be able to ensure that the 2 billion will be used in a worthwhile manner and that other markets could also be modernized along the way. Well, this is the beginning. It is hard to make a start, but once we begin, I'm sure that we will be able to go on full speed. Well, taking in your current experiences, in the 2 billion funding, do you have a timetable? Let's say in the past you need to come up to conceptualize, reach a consensus, design, etc. Would you now reduce it to 1 year or less than or 9 months? Yes, if you agree with our views that you would consider the pros and cons of the markets, so would you also supply how you look at these merits, and perhaps also submit it to us for our reference. Oh yes, thank you. We would provide you with additional information after the meeting. As I hope that after listening to our concerns, you could give us our answers. Because efficiency is slow, you're not fully utilizing your resources, and you need to ensure that we'll be able to develop our markets in a sustainable manner. Any other questions? If not, then we can conclude this item. We'll move on to AOB. When we have a next date of meeting. We are going to hold a hearing on July 10th, 10:45 in the morning. So this will be on the landscape and management and modernization of markets, and we're going to invite the public to express their views. So we are going to put up this information on our website, and we would also send this information to the 18 district councils so that they would also know of our hearing. Mr. Wan.
都唔係問題。
Mr. Andrew Wan. Members mentioned that private markets are being renovated quickly. So can you provide further information on the timeline or the work timeline for renovating public markets? Can the Undersecretary provide papers afterwards? So hopefully members can attend the public hearing on the 10th of July. And further to what Dr. N. Chang mentioned last time, she hopes to arrange visits of our public markets. The Secretariat and government would arrange site visits to public markets next month. As for the suggestion by Dr. N. Chang, we would work with the government and Secretariat, and we would report to members later. Barring any other business, the meeting is adjourned. I'd like to thank members and the government for attending. Thank you.